1 million people need 2 million pounds of food every single day, long before the invention of refrigeration. The existence of ancient megacities is a paradox solved by invisible genius. In this exploration, you will gain a complete understanding of the 5 hidden pillars that made civilization itself possible. We will uncover how a city's appetite could reshape entire landscapes, and why the most important building was not a palace, but a warehouse. By the end, you will see history not as a list of kings and battles, but as a masterclass in organization and survival. What forgotten system kept a metropolis fed when a single bad harvest could mean collapse? How did empires move mountains of grain across continents using only wind, water, and human muscle? The answers reveal a silent symphony of coordination more complex than any war. What do you think is the greatest logistical challenge humanity has ever faced? That number, 2 million pounds, is an abstraction until you give it a shape. Think of a modern semi-truck fully loaded. To deliver just one day's basic grain ration for ancient Rome, you would need a convoy of 100 of those massive vehicles, rolling into the city gates in an endless line every single sunrise. And that is just the grain. It does not account for vegetables, fruit, meat, oil, or wine. This was the non-negotiable daily heartbeat of a million-person city, a logistic skip a beat. We call them cities, but that is almost a misnomer. In a world where 99 out of 100 people lived in small farming communities, a metropolis of 1 million souls was less a city and more a gravitational anomaly. It was a black hole for resources, pulling in the lifeblood of entire regions. Rome did not feed itself from the fields just outside its walls. Its appetite reached across the Mediterranean, to the wheat fields of North Africa, to the Nile Valley, to the island of Sicily. Chang'an in China's Tang Dynasty drew from the fertile basins of the Yangtze River 1,000 miles away. These were not local economies. They were the world's first truly global supply chains, operating with sail, sweat, and sheer administrative will. So the foundational question is not how they stored the food or how they moved it. The first question is far more basic. Where did it all possibly come from? The answer begins with a complete reimagining of the landscape itself. To fuel a city of that scale, you do not just farm more land. You invent an entirely new kind of countryside. The first pillar of this impossible system was the agricultural hinterland, a term that sounds academic but describes something brutally simple. It was the city's dedicated stomach, a vast engineered landscape whose sole purpose was to produce an unending surplus. This was not the romantic countryside of small family farms. This was agriculture as a massive, industrialized project, centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Think of the Roman latifundia, estates so large that owners could ride for days without leaving their own property, or the endless, meticulously flooded rice terraces that fed the capitals of China, transforming entire watersheds into geometric patterns of staggering productivity. These were factories without roofs where the product was calories and the machinery was human labor, animal power, and hydrological genius. Vast networks of canals and aqueducts brought water to arid land. Complex cycles of crop rotation kept the soil from exhaustion. The entire ecosystem was bent toward a single goal, feeding the distant, insatiable metropolis. This created what historians now call a food shed, a map defined not by politics but by decay. Picture a target with the city at the bullseye. In the innermost ring, just a day's journey away, came the most fragile goods, fresh vegetables, leafy greens, and dairy. The next ring out, within a few days' travel, supplied fruits, eggs, and perhaps freshly slaughtered poultry. Beyond that, in the outermost ring, came the empire's true lifeblood, the durable calories that could survive a long journey, mountains of grain, legumes, and salted goods. The size of a city was literally limited by the radius of this food shed, the distance a donkey cart or a river barge could travel before its cargo became inedible. So the city's hunger reached out and sculpted the world. Forests were cleared, marshes were drained, and nomadic grazing lands were plowed under to create more of these calorie factories. The rhythms of millions of rural lives were set by this relentless urban demand. Every spring planting, every autumn harvest was an act of devotion to a place most of those farmers would never see. They grew food they would not eat to sustain a way of life they might never know. But here lies the critical tension. Growing this ocean of food was a monumental achievement. Getting it to the city before it spoiled was an entirely different kind of miracle. The sheer scale of production was only the beginning of the problem. All that food was useless, even dangerous, if it simply rotted in a field 100 miles from the city. This brings us to the second foundational pillar, a network of structures so vital they were often more heavily guarded than the royal treasury. These were the granaries, the empire's strategic food banks. In a world without cold storage, preservation was not about keeping things cool. It was about creating a timeless environment. Grains, dried legumes, and salted goods were the financial reserves of the ancient world, and the granary was the vault. Think of the massive horrea of Ostia, Rome's port city, where mountains of North African wheat waited in cavernous, multi-story warehouses before their final journey up the Tiber River. Or the vast state granaries of Chang'an in Tang Dynasty, China, part of a system so extensive it was known as the ever-normal granaries. These were not simple sheds. They were feats of architectural ingenuity designed for a single purpose: to cheat decay. Floors were raised on pillars to allow air to circulate underneath, preventing dampness and discouraging pests. Walls were built thick and insulated to maintain a stable, cool temperature, shielding the contents from the sweltering summer heat and winter frosts. Ventilation shafts were carefully placed to manage humidity. A well-designed granary could keep grain edible for years, sometimes even decades. This transformed the granary from a storage unit into a powerful economic and political tool. It was a buffer against disaster. A single poor harvest in a distant province no longer meant immediate famine in the capital. The granaries could release their reserves, smoothing out the crisis. They were a defense against siege, allowing a city to withstand months of encirclement. Perhaps most importantly, they were a weapon against market panic. In Rome, the state operated the Annona system, using its granaries to control the price of grain. If private merchants tried to hoard wheat to drive up prices during a shortage, officials could flood the market with public grain, stabilizing costs and preventing riots. In China, the ever-normal granaries served a similar purpose, buying grain when it was cheap and abundant after a good harvest, and selling it at a fair price when it was scarce. This was one of the world's earliest forms of state-sponsored social welfare, a recognition that feeding the population was the primary duty of government. The management of these granaries required a bureaucracy of almost unimaginable precision. Every single bushel that entered was recorded on papyrus or bamboo slips by armies of accountants. Its quality was inspected, its storage location was logged. Guards, often some of the most trusted soldiers in the empire, protected these sites not from foreign armies but from theft, fire, and the ever-present threat of rot. The granary network turned the chaotic, seasonal pulse of the harvest into a steady, year-round heartbeat for the city. But this entire magnificent system, this empire of stillness, relied on a constant, roaring river of motion. The grain had to get there first, and that journey required conquering distance itself on a scale that defies belief. A mountain of grain sitting in a provincial granary was just a promise. The real magic happened in the movement. To feed a city of 1 million, you needed a circulatory system for an entire civilization, a network of arteries that could pump life across continents. This was the third pillar, a tri-modal transport web of road, river, and sea, each with its own strengths and all working in a fragile, synchronized harmony. The roads came first in the imagination of empire. Roman roads, those famous straight lines carved across landscapes, were not built for the speed of messengers or the march of legions alone. Their true economic purpose was to bear the relentless, grinding weight of the ox cart. A single cart pulled by 2 oxen could manage about half a ton of grain. It was slow, perhaps 12 miles a day, but it was reliable. These engineered roads, with their layered foundations and drainage ditches, allowed that heavy traffic to continue in nearly all weather, connecting inland farms to river ports or coastal harbors. They were the capillaries gathering the surplus from the hinterland, but for bulk transport the wheel was hopelessly inefficient. The real heavy lifting was done by water. A river barge on the Tiber, the Yellow River, or the Tigris could carry the equivalent of dozens, sometimes hundreds of those ox carts. Rivers were liquid highways, nature's gift to logistics, and empires spent fortunes to improve them, dredging channels, building canals to link basins, and maintaining towpaths where men or animals could pull barges upstream against the current. The river moved the mountain from the farm to the sea, and then the sea performed its miracle. Maritime transport was the superhighway of the ancient world. A single, large Roman grain ship, a corbiter with its deep, rounded hull, could carry over 1,000 tons of wheat. That one vessel, sailing from Alexandria in Egypt to the port of Ostia, carried enough grain to feed tens of thousands of people for a month. The Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea became global conveyor belts. This was not random sailing. It was a scheduled, seasonal operation governed by immense practical knowledge. Ship captains knew the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean reversed direction with the seasons, creating predictable maritime highways. They understood the storm patterns of the Mediterranean, sailing in the safer summer months and staying in port during the dangerous winter. The development of the lateen sail allowed ships to tack against the wind, making voyages more reliable. This entire system, from dirt path to open ocean, demanded constant, obsessive maintenance. An empire did not just build these networks, it had to nurse them like a living organism. Armies of laborers cleared silt from river channels to keep barges floating. Crews patched road surfaces worn down by countless cartwheels. Engineers built lighthouses to guide ships into port at night, and massive breakwaters to create safe harbors. And because this flow of food was the empire's lifeline, it was also its greatest vulnerability. Military patrols, from Roman soldiers on road watch to imperial navies, fought a constant battle against bandits on land and pirates at sea. A single successful raid on a grain convoy could trigger panic in a city 1,000 miles away. The final, invisible layer of genius was scheduling. You could not have 200 grain ships all arrive at Ostia on the same day. The port would choke, the warehouses would overflow, the grain would spoil on the docks, so logistics officers, using estimates of sailing times and harvest dates, staged this incoming flood. Ships from Egypt, from North Africa, from Sicily were scheduled to arrive in a steady, manageable stream. It was a silent, continent-wide ballet, conducted with papyrus dispatches and shouted orders, ensuring the city's daily bread arrived not in a tsunami, but in a reliable, endless tide. Yet, even after the grain was unloaded at the docks, the journey was not over. It now faced its most intimate enemy, time itself, within the bustling chaos of the city streets. But a ship in a harbor is just a beautiful sculpture. The real work began the moment its hull scraped the sand. Every sack of grain, every amphora of oil, had to be moved from that ship onto a dock, into a cart through crowded streets, and finally into a warehouse or a mill. And this movement, this final, gritty transfer of millions of pounds of material, had no engine but the human body. This was the fourth pillar, the human engine, an immense and often forgotten workforce that powered the entire machine with muscle, sweat, and intricate organization. Think of the port of Ostia on a busy day. The shouts would have been deafening. Teams of dockworkers, backs bent under the Mediterranean sun, moved in a rhythmic dance across narrow gangplanks. Each man carried a sack of wheat weighing as much as a modern person. They formed human chains, passing cargo from the ship's hold to the dock, where another group loaded it onto waiting carts. The heat, the dust, the ever-present risk of a shifting load or a slippery plank. This was the brutal, physical reality of civilization's bounty. In many ancient societies, the most predictable and controllable source of labor for such relentless, dangerous work was slavery. The Roman Annona system, which guaranteed bread for the city's poor, was built on this foundation. Enslaved individuals worked the docks, manned the mills along the Tiber where grain was ground into flour, and hauled materials for the public bakeries. They were not just laborers, they were a calculated, depreciating asset in a vast economic equation. Their lives and bodies factored into the cost of keeping the city fed. Their presence allowed for a scale and consistency of operation that would have been far more difficult with a purely free labor force that could come and go as it pleased. But slavery was not the only system that moved these mountains. Across the world, different cultures engineered their own solutions to the labor problem. In ancient China, a complex system known as corvée labor required peasants to contribute a set number of days each year to public works. This mandatory service built the canals that transported grain and maintained the roads that carried it. It was a tax paid not in coin but in time and muscle, directly harnessed by the state for the common good, or at least for the stability of the empire. Alongside these forced or conscripted systems thrived a world of free professionals, the skilled movers of the ancient world. Porters, carters, and boatmen formed essential guilds and associations. A carter in Rome did not just own a cart and oxen, he possessed deep, localized knowledge which streets could handle his weight at which time of day, which officials needed a discreet bribe to look the other way, and how to secure his cargo against thieves. These men developed their own slang, their own codes of conduct, and strict hierarchies. They were the independent contractors of their age, and the city's survival depended on their willingness to work. Coordinating this chaos of human activity required another layer of bureaucracy, the middle managers of antiquity. Foremen on the docks used tally sticks and shouted orders to track which ship was being unloaded and which cart was destined for which warehouse. Schedulers in administrative offices tried to balance the flow of carts through the city's narrow gates to prevent paralyzing traffic jams. Overseers ensured that the state's share of grain was properly collected and stored, their scrolls filled with numbers that represented the literal tons of food passing through their domain. This human engine was the kinetic energy of the empire. Every plan drawn on papyrus, every law passed in the Senate, every ship built in a shipyard was meaningless without the thousands of backs that bent to execute the vision. Their collective toil was a relentless human current flowing into the city, a daily miracle so ordinary it became invisible. Yet, for all this staggering effort in growing, storing, moving, and unloading food, the final, most delicate challenge remained. How did you get that single day's ration, that 2 million pounds of sustenance, from the central granaries and markets into the hands, and ultimately the stomachs, of 1 million individual people, every single day, without descending into chaos or riot? The final mile was the most dangerous of all. After crossing seas and mountains, the empire's lifeblood now flowed into a jungle of narrow streets, crowded forums, and human desperation. Here, the cold logic of logistics met the volatile heat of the market. Unchecked, this was where the system could catastrophically fail, where grain could be plentiful in warehouses yet unaffordable in the stalls, where famine could erupt not from empty fields but from full pockets held tightly shut. To prevent this, ancient governments did something radical for their time. They stepped directly into the marketplace, not as occasional players, but as permanent, powerful referees. This was the birth of economic policy as a tool of survival. In Rome, this responsibility fell to a specific magistrate, the Cura Annoni, a position of immense power and even greater stress. His job was to be the guardian of the grain supply from ship to stomach. He negotiated contracts with shippers, managed the public granaries, and most critically, he intervened directly in the market. If private merchants, smelling a shortage on the wind, began to buy up grain and hold it back to artificially inflate prices, the Cura Annoni had the authority to flood the market with grain from the state reserves. He could set maximum prices, confiscate hoarded stocks, and punish speculators. This was not merely about economics, it was about preventing the kind of bread riots that could topple governments. The famous phrase "bread and circuses" was not a critique of frivolity, but a stark description of a core governing policy. Providing affordable food and public entertainment were the two primary ways the state maintained the peace and loyalty of its massive, restless urban population. Across the world, similar systems emerged with the same goal: stability through fairness. In the cities of the medieval Islamic world, the mutazib, an inspector acting under the ethical principles of Hizbah, patrolled the markets. His focus was on the morality of commerce, especially for essentials like bread, flour, and oil. He carried standard weights and measures, checking to ensure bakers were not selling undersized loaves or merchants were not watering down vinegar. He ensured pathways were clear for customers and that waste was properly disposed of to maintain public health. This was market regulation framed as a religious and civic duty, a promise that trade would be conducted with honesty for the good of the community. The most powerful symbol of this entire social contract was not a law or an official, but a humble building, the public bakery. In Rome, the state did not typically bake the bread itself for the entire city. Instead, it provided subsidized grain or flour to licensed bakers, who were then bound by strict regulations on price and loaf size. These bakeries became neighborhood institutions, their ovens burning day and night. The distribution of bread, often directly to citizens holding a tessera, a small token that entitled them to a daily ration, was the most tangible daily proof of the state's promise. You could hold the result of that entire continent-spanning system in your hands, warm and heavy. It was a direct, edible link between the emperor in his palace and the laborer in his apartment. Managing this intricate dance between state control and private enterprise required a new kind of professional, the administrator. Armies of clerks, accountants, and inspectors formed the paper-based nervous system of the empire. They tracked inventory from ship manifests to warehouse ledgers to bakery receipts. They calculated the complex subsidies, enforced the regulations, and tried to predict next season's needs based on last year's shortfalls. This bureaucratic class was the glue that held the physical machine and the economic rules together. Yet, for all this staggering coordination, a haunting question lingered at the edge of every full granary and every bustling market. What happened when the music stopped, when the harvests failed, not in one province but across several, when the ships could not sail or the human engine simply broke down? The entire magnificent, fragile edifice was built on an assumption of continuous flow, but history is rarely so kind. A single mistake in this ledger could mean empty bellies for thousands. Behind every ship, every cart, and every sack of grain moved a shadow, a river of information flowing on papyrus and parchment. This was the fifth and final pillar, the bureaucratic spine, a nervous system built entirely from paper, ink, and human memory. To feed a city of 1 million, you first had to learn how to count it, to measure its hunger, and to predict its needs with a precision that feels almost modern. The scale of data was staggering. Every harvest in every province had to be estimated and recorded. Every ship leaving Alexandria for Rome carried a manifest listing its captain, its crew, and the exact number of sacks in its hold. Every granary door had a logbook noting what went in, what came out, and the condition of the grain. In Rome, this was the domain of the Praefectus Annoni, the prefect of the grain supply, one of the most powerful men in the empire. His offices were not filled with soldiers but with scribes. Their tools were not swords but style for scratching numbers into wax tablets, and reed pens for inking final tallies onto long scrolls of papyrus. They practiced double-entry bookkeeping centuries before it was formalized in Renaissance Italy, a system of checks and balances to ensure that what was shipped was what arrived. Corruption was a constant threat, a silent tax that could starve a city as surely as a drought, so the records were everything. If a provincial governor claimed a poor harvest to pay less tax grain, central officials could check his figures against previous years and against reports from neighboring regions. If a ship's captain arrived in Ostia with a hold suspiciously light, his manifest could be audited against the loading documents from Alexandria. This paper trail was the empire's immune system, identifying leaks and inefficiencies before they became fatal. Across the world in Tang Dynasty China, the bureaucratic machine achieved a breathtaking sophistication. The Ministry of Revenue maintained detailed household registers, a census that tracked not just people, but their age, their landholdings, and their expected tax liability. The famous ever-normal granary system was not just a series of warehouses, it was a dynamic database. Officials used these records to model supply and demand, deciding when to buy grain to build reserves and when to sell it to stabilize prices. Taxes were often collected in kind, meaning farmers paid their debt to the state not with coins, but with sacks of millet or rice. This required an army of clerks to assess the quality of the grain, to weigh it, and to issue receipts, transforming agricultural surplus directly into state power. The medium itself shaped the message. In Rome, the wax tablet was the scratchpad of empire, reusable and perfect for quick calculations in a bustling port office. The final permanent record went onto a papyrus scroll, filed away in archives that were as vital as armories. In China, scribes wrote on interconnected bamboo slips, tied together with cord to form a flexible, durable document. This was information technology, and its speed was limited by a horse's gallop or a ship's sail. Yet it worked. It allowed for forecasting, for a planner in Chang'an to know, months in advance, roughly how much grain would be coming down the Grand Canal from the south after the autumn harvest. It enabled rationing during a siege, with officials knowing exactly how many mouths they had to feed and for how long their supplies would last. Most importantly, it turned food into a strategic weapon. No Roman general could plan a campaign without first consulting the grain ledgers to see if the army could be fed. The movement of legions was dictated not just by tactics, but by logistics, by the location of supply depots and the harvest schedules of conquered territories. The true monument to these ancient empires, then, is not just the Colosseum or the Great Wall. It is the humble, disintegrated scroll, the faded ink on bamboo. It was this relentless, mundane act of record-keeping that made the unimaginable seem routine. It proved that long before the silicon chip, the most powerful technology was organized information, the quiet blueprint that held a world of plenty together against the relentless pull of chaos. Yet for all the ledgers and grain ships, the most vital ingredient in the entire system was one we rarely think about: water. Every single calorie that reached a citizen's table first had to be washed, mixed, cooked, or processed with it. While 2 million pounds of food arrived daily, a city of 1 million required millions of gallons of fresh, clean water. This was not just for drinking. It was for boiling legumes, for washing vegetables, for the massive municipal bakeries that needed it to turn flour into dough. Breweries and taverns consumed enormous quantities for beer and wine. The butcher's trade required constant rinsing to prevent spoilage and disease. Without this parallel river of purity flowing into the city, the mountain of food would become a mountain of contamination and decay. Securing this water was perhaps the greatest public works project of the ancient world, a silent companion to the food supply chain. The aqueducts of Rome are the most famous examples, but the principle was universal. These were not mere water channels, they were precision gravity-fed machines carved in stone. Engineers would locate a spring or a clean river source dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Then, with painstaking surveys using simple water levels, they would chart a course with a near-perfect, gentle slope all the way to the city. The water had to flow steadily, neither too fast to erode the channel nor too slow to stagnate. The result was a constant, reliable infusion of life, pouring into public fountains, bathhouses, and the homes of the wealthy. In Constantinople, the emperor built vast underground cisterns, like the breathtaking basilica cistern with its forest of columns, to store this precious flow against siege or drought. But water's role extended far beyond the kitchen. It was the foundation of urban sanitation, the invisible shield that kept food-borne illness at bay. All those meals consumed by 1 million people created a corresponding river of waste. If left in streets or open pits, it would seep into wells, attract vermin, and create the perfect conditions for epidemics that could hollow out a city faster than any army. The answer was to put water to work as a liquid broom. Rome's Cloaca Maxima began as an open drainage ditch and was later vaulted over into a proper sewer, using water from public baths and fountains to constantly flush waste down into the Tiber River. In the cities of the Indus Valley centuries earlier, sophisticated drainage systems were built into the very fabric of residential streets, ensuring waste was carried away from living and cooking areas. This was not about comfort, it was a matter of survival. Clean water in and dirty water out were two sides of the same coin, a basic formula for public health that directly determined whether a dense population could thrive without constant crisis. Finally, water provided the muscle to process the food itself. Before the steam engine, the consistent, powerful force needed to grind mountains of grain into flour came from rivers and aqueducts. The Barbagal Mill complex in Roman Gaul was a staggering example of industrial-scale thinking. Aqueduct water was channeled down a hillside to turn a series of 16 overshot water wheels, each powering a pair of millstones. This single factory could produce enough flour to feed an estimated 80,000 people, automating a back-breaking daily task. From the aqueduct to the sewer to the water wheel, this integrated hydraulic network was the circulatory and nervous system of the city. It cleaned the food, powered its preparation, and carried away the dangers of its consumption. To manage 1 million hungry mouths, you first had to master the flow of 1 million gallons of water. And yet, even with full granaries and clean water, the entire structure rested on a foundation of profound fragility, a single point of failure that could unravel everything in a season. But bread and grain were only the foundation of the diet, the canvas upon which a more complex and vital nutritional picture was painted. A city of 1 million needed protein, fat, and vitamins to survive, and these came from the most treacherous category of all, perishables. Meat, fish, dairy, and fresh vegetables presented a relentless race against spoilage, a race that could not be won with granaries alone. The solution was not to fight nature, but to collaborate with it, using chemistry and climate to transform fleeting freshness into lasting sustenance. For meat and fish, the primary weapons were salt, smoke, and dry air. Salting or curing drew moisture out of tissue, creating an environment where bacteria could not thrive. It was a process that demanded an entire industry, from the vast salt pans where seawater was evaporated to the bustling workshops where butchers rubbed down sides of pork or beef. Smoking added a protective layer of chemicals from burning wood, further preserving and flavoring the meat. The result was durable, portable protein, food that could survive a journey from a provincial farm to a city market or sit in a household larder for months. Fish, especially from the Mediterranean or the North Sea, were often split open, salted heavily, and dried in the sun and wind until they became hard, wooden planks of nutrition to be soaked and cooked later. The most famous Roman example, however, was liquid. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, was the universal condiment of the empire. Made by layering small fish like anchovies with salt in large vats and leaving them to ferment for months in the sun, the resulting pungent, salty liquid was bottled and shipped everywhere. It was more than a flavor, it was a brilliant method of preservation, capturing the nutritional value of seafood in a stable, non-perishable form that could be added to countless dishes. Dairy presented a different challenge as fresh milk soured within hours in a world without pasteurization or consistent cooling. The answer was again transformation. Milk was most commonly consumed as cheese, a process that concentrated its fats and proteins into a solid that could be aged, stored, and transported. In cooler climates, milk was allowed to ferment naturally into products like yogurt or kefir, where beneficial bacteria outcompeted harmful ones, creating a tart, preserved food. Vegetables and fruits faced their own seasonal limits. Beyond the short harvest windows, they were pickled in vinegar or brine, dried on racks in the sun, or for root vegetables like turnips and onions, stored in the deep, consistent cool of underground cellars. This rhythm was dictated by the annual cycle of nature. The autumn slaughter was a crucial event in the agricultural calendar. After a summer of grazing, livestock were at their peak weight. With winter coming and scarce fodder available, it made economic sense to cull most of the herds, creating a sudden, massive surplus of fresh meat. This bounty had to be processed immediately, triggering a community-wide effort of salting, smoking, and rendering fat that would supply protein through the lean months. For the wealthiest elites, there was one more extraordinary tool, a glimpse of future technology born from simple observation. In mountainous regions and in empires with the reach to command it, snow and ice were harvested from high peaks, packed with insulating straw in deep underground pits called ice houses. This ancient refrigeration, incredibly expensive and labor-intensive, allowed a privileged few to enjoy chilled drinks or preserve delicate foods for short periods. It was a dramatic demonstration of understanding thermal mass, proving that the concept of cold storage was known, even if its widespread application was millennia away. Each of these techniques, from the humble root cellar to the sprawling garum factory, spawned its own specialized trades. Salt merchants, smokehouse operators, cheesemakers, and pickle vendors formed essential threads in the urban economic tapestry. Their work ensured the city's diet was not merely a monotonous sea of grain, but a varied, resilient, and surprisingly sophisticated menu, all achieved through the quiet, daily alchemy of preservation. This intricate dance with decay kept the city alive, but it relied on a deeper, more volatile foundation, a promise of stability that was always being negotiated. The relentless flow of grain and the hum of the market were not just practical achievements, they were acts of faith. To truly bind a million souls together, the cold mechanics of logistics needed a story, a meaning that reached beyond the ledger and the granary door. This is where the system found its soul, in the powerful fusion of religion and ritual with the daily act of eating. In ancient societies, the line between the warehouse and the temple was often blurred because ensuring the food supply was seen not merely as an administrative duty, but as a sacred covenant between the people, their rulers, and the gods. A failed harvest was not just bad weather, it was a sign of divine displeasure. A bountiful one was a blessing to be celebrated and reciprocated. This belief turned religious institutions into some of the earliest and most trusted logistics hubs. In the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia, the towering ziggurat was not just a spiritual center, it was the economic heart. Temple complexes, acting on behalf of the city's patron deity, collected vast portions of the agricultural surplus as offerings. This grain, stored in temple granaries, became a divine reserve. It fed the priests and temple workers, yes, but it also served as a critical public stockpile. In times of shortage, it could be distributed to the community as an act of piety, reinforcing the idea that the gods, through their earthly servants, provided for the faithful. The temple was both bank and breadbasket. Its authority derived from its perceived role as the intermediary between the people and the forces that controlled the rain and the sun. This concept echoed through the ages. In Rome, the grain dole itself was sanctified. It was distributed under the watchful gaze of the goddess Annona, the divine personification of the grain supply. Her image was stamped on coins, and her altar stood in the bustling port of Ostia. This was brilliant political theology. By framing the distribution of bread as a gift from the emperor under divine auspices, it transformed a practical welfare program into a sacred obligation. Receiving your monthly grain ration was not just collecting calories, it was participating in a ritual that affirmed your place in a divinely protected order. The emperor was not just a politician managing resources, he was the chief priest ensuring the gods smiled upon Rome. This spiritual layer provided a powerful glue for social cohesion. It helped justify the immense inequality and labor required by the system, framing it as part of a cosmic balance. Major public festivals served as the dramatic, edible highlights of this belief. Think of the Roman Saturnalia, a December festival where social norms were temporarily inverted, and masters served meals to their enslaved individuals. Or the lavish public banquets funded by wealthy citizens in Greek city-states, known as liturgies. In China, the New Year celebrations involved state-sponsored feasts that reinforced familial and imperial harmony. These were not mere parties, they were carefully orchestrated social safety valves. By periodically offering a spectacular, shared experience of abundance, the state and elite could alleviate daily tensions and demonstrate their benevolent power in the most visceral way possible, through full stomachs and communal joy. The feast was a promise, a tangible reminder of what the system could provide when it functioned as intended. It turned the populace from a mass of consumers into participants in a shared sacred story. The ritual slaughter of animals, the offering of the first fruits, the procession of bread to the temple, all these acts embedded the logistics of survival into the calendar of the sacred. They reassured a nervous population that their leaders were not just accountants, but guardians of a divine order where food would never fail. This ideological framework was the final, essential ingredient. It provided the why that made the incredible how acceptable. It transformed the grimy work of the dockworker and the anxious calculations of the scribe into parts of a grand, cosmic endeavor. Yet, for all this spiritual and bureaucratic armor, the entire structure remained terrifyingly vulnerable to forces no prayer or policy could fully control. The scale of Rome's appetite is hard to overstate. Every year, a fleet of specialized ships known as naves Cordicarii hauled 150,000 tons of wheat across the Mediterranean. That is enough grain to fill a modern supertanker, a volume of food that had to navigate pirate-infested waters, unpredictable storms, and the relentless calendar of the harvest. The entire operation existed to serve a single, revolutionary idea, the Annona. What began in the late Republic as a sporadic, politically motivated handout of free grain to citizen men evolved under Emperor Augustus into something far more profound, a permanent, state-run guarantee. It was a promise from the emperor to the people of Rome, a social contract written not on parchment but in daily bread. This promise required a machine of breathtaking complexity, and at its helm stood one of the most powerful men in the empire, the Prefectus Annona. He was not a general, but a logistics master. His authority stretched from the wheat fields of the Nile Delta to the crowded apartment blocks of the Suburra. He commanded a dedicated fleet, negotiated contracts with private shippers, managed the empire's network of granaries, and oversaw the army of clerks, dockworkers, and bakers who turned raw grain into finished loaves. His budget was enormous, his responsibility absolute. A single season of failed shipments could mean his career, or worse, the emperor's downfall. Follow the journey of a single sack of Egyptian wheat. Its voyage ended not at Rome, but at the bustling port of Ostia, 17 miles down the Tiber River. Here, the deep-drafted sea-going ships could not navigate the shallow, winding river. So the grain was unloaded by gangs of workers onto the noisy, chaotic docks, where it was immediately transferred onto smaller, flat-bottomed river barges. These barges were then towed upstream against the current, a slow, muscular journey that brought the lifeblood of the empire into the heart of the city itself. Upon arrival, the grain entered the true temples of Roman stability, the horrea. These were not simple sheds, but multi-storied, fortress-like warehouses with raised floors for air circulation and thick walls to regulate temperature. The Horrea Galbi complex, for example, could hold enough grain to feed the city for months. From the horrea, the grain moved to the final stage of its transformation. It was distributed either as grain or flour to licensed bakers throughout the city's neighborhoods. These bakers operated under strict state control, their loaf sizes and prices regulated to prevent profiteering. For the poorest citizens holding a small lead token called a tessera frumentaria, this system meant a direct monthly ration of grain, a tangible symbol of their membership in the Roman world. For everyone else, it meant affordable, readily available bread in the markets, a buffer against the wild price swings that could ignite desperation. The true power of the Annona, however, was not in its mechanics but in its politics. Emperors understood that their legitimacy was baked into this daily bread. They stamped their faces on the sacks of grain, built monuments to the goddess Annona, and personally oversaw the distribution. The message was clear: the emperor is your provider. But this made the system the empire's most sensitive pressure point. When shipments were delayed by storm or mismanagement, the city's mood darkened instantly. History records riots that began not over taxes or tyranny, but over the price and availability of bread. To control Rome was to control its stomach. The Annona was more than a welfare program. It was the central nervous system of imperial power, proving that in the ancient world, the most formidable army was sometimes a well-managed bakery. While Rome mastered the sea, another empire on the opposite side of the world conquered a different element entirely. Tang Dynasty Chang'an, a city of over 1 million souls, was fed not by the open ocean, but by a river of human creation. The lifeline was not a fleet of ships, but a single, staggering ditch of water, the Grand Canal. This was more than a canal. It was a geographic revolution, an artificial river built to bend the very shape of the continent to the will of the capital. For over 1,000 miles, it stitched together the empire's two great economic halves, the arid, political north where Chang'an stood, and the lush, fertile, rice-padded south. Without it, the capital would have been a powerful idea stranded in a nutritional desert. With it, the Tang dynasty built a hydraulic empire. The system's fuel was not coin, but rice itself. Peasants in the fertile Yangtze Delta paid their taxes in kind, meaning their obligation to the state was measured in sacks of grain. This was a brilliant, self-replenishing logistics chain. The government did not need to first collect silver, then use it to buy food, introducing merchants and market volatility into the equation. Instead, it collected the food directly. At appointed granaries along the canal, this rice was loaded onto a vast, state-owned fleet of barges, thousands of them, forming a continuous, slow-moving conveyor belt headed north. The journey could take months, a procession of abundance moving at the pace of a towed barge, guarded by soldiers and managed by an army of clerks who tracked every single sack. This was the empire's bloodstream, and the Grand Canal was its central artery. To manage this colossal flow, the Tang perfected a system of bureaucratic genius known as the equal transportation system. Its goal was simple in concept, impossible in execution: stabilize prices and prevent famine across an entire continent. Here is how it worked. Government agents stationed throughout the empire acted as economic censors. In a southern province, after a bumper harvest, rice would be cheap. The agents would use state funds to purchase the surplus at a fair price, building up the official granaries. Meanwhile, in a northern region that had suffered a poor season, prices would be spiking. The agents there would release grain from their reserves, selling it at a controlled price to ease the shortage. The Grand Canal was the physical network that allowed this balancing act. Surplus grain from the south could be shipped north to replenish reserves, or vice versa. It was a giant, empire-wide shock absorber, using geography and administration to smooth out the natural volatility of harvests. Within Chang'an itself, this river of grain fed a city of breathtaking order. The metropolis was laid out in a precise grid of walled wards, each with a specific purpose. Official markets were not chaotic bazaars, but strictly regulated zones, open only at designated hours and overseen by government magistrates. These officials were the enforcers of trust in a city of strangers. They patrolled the markets with standard weights and measures, cracking down on merchants who used shrunken scales or sold spoiled goods. They inspected the quality of rice, flour, and oil, ensuring that the sustenance flowing in from the canal was not degraded by fraud at its final destination. In the eastern market alone, warehouses stood ready to hold the goods from over 300 different prefectures, a tangible map of the empire's dependency. The contrast with Rome is revealing. Both empires fed 1 million people, but their tools reflected their worlds. Rome was a maritime power, its logistics leveraging the natural highway of the Mediterranean, a network of many ports and many private shippers, managed by a state that intervened heavily in the market. The Tang model was continental, centralized, and hydraulic. It relied on one monumental, state-built and state-controlled infrastructure, the canal, moving a tax resource collected directly from the people. It was a closed loop of power and sustenance. The Roman system was adaptive to the winds. The Tang system was a feat of absolute control over water and land. One asked, "How can we harness the sea to serve our city?" The other declared, "We will move a river to make our city possible." Both answers worked for a time, holding back the specter of hunger through a combination of engineering, administration, and sheer imperial will. Yet, this very success created its own profound vulnerability, for a system built on such perfect control could only withstand so much strain before the entire design began to fracture. But this grand bargain between the capital and the countryside created a paradox of power. To protect the river of grain, you needed to field an army. And to feed that army, you needed an entirely separate, parallel river of grain. The military was not just a consumer in this system, it was the system's sharpest edge and its ultimate purpose. A Roman legion on the march was a mobile city of 5,000 men, each requiring thousands of calories a day to march, build, and fight. Their demand was non-negotiable and immediate. This relentless need forged some of history's most durable military rations. Roman soldiers carried bucellatum, a simple, twice-baked hardtack biscuit that was virtually indestructible, along with laridum, salted pork. This was calories engineered for conquest, food that could survive months in a backpack, be eaten on the move, and provide the energy to build a fort by sundown. The legion's supply train, its impedimenta, was a logistical tale that included not just food, but tools, tents, and siege equipment, all moving at the pace of oxen and mules. The army's very structure was a lesson in mobile logistics, yet the relationship went far deeper than just feeding troops. Look at a map of Roman expansion, and you are not just looking at a quest for glory, you are looking at a shopping list for grain. The conquest of Egypt, the empire's richest breadbasket, was not an accidental prize. It was a deliberate, strategic annexation to secure the single most important source of wheat for the city of Rome. Campaigns in the Fertile Crescent, in North Africa, in Sicily, all followed this same brutal logic. The army's primary strategic role was often to seize and then protect the productive lands that fed the capital. It was a circular, self-justifying engine of empire. The city needed the army to secure its food, and the army needed the city's immense logistical apparatus to be fed. This created a feedback loop where economic policy and military policy became indistinguishable. The provinces that grew the grain were often the same provinces that required the most legions to garrison them, to quell rebellion and ensure the taxes paid in wheat kept flowing. The soldier guarding a granary in Alexandria was protecting the very calories that would eventually be baked into the bread he might eat next year, back in Rome or on another frontier. This military-industrial complex, ancient in its form, blurred every line. Was the Praefectus Annoni the grain official, a civilian administrator, or a quartermaster general? Was a new canal project an economic improvement or a military supply line? The answer was always both. The army's need for reliable supply drove innovations that later benefited civilians, from standardized weights and measures to the construction of all-weather roads and fortified way stations. Conversely, the state's expertise in moving millions of bushels of tax grain gave it the blueprint for supplying armies across continents. The peace of the city and the violence of the frontier were two sides of the same coin, minted from wheat and salted pork. This fusion of purpose reached its most poignant expression in the life of the soldier himself. His pay was often partly in coin, partly in kind, a direct ration of grain. His retirement bonus was frequently a grant of farmland, turning the old veteran into a producer for the very system that once fed him. He was a cog in the machine, and then he became part of the soil that fueled it. The entire edifice presented a haunting equation. Stability at the center required constant expansion and control at the edges. The very act of feeding 1 million people in one place demanded the perpetual attention, and sometimes the subjugation, of millions more scattered across the known world. It was a pyramid of consumption with a foundation of relentless motion, both commercial and military, all to maintain the illusion of stillness and plenty in the heart of the empire. The silent symphony of grain ships and ledgers played against a constant, low hum of dread. For all its ingenuity, the system that fed 1 million was balanced on a knife's edge, vulnerable to a dozen different kinds of silence. The quiet of a windless sea that stalled the fleet, the deeper quiet of a spring that brought no rain to the wheat fields of Egypt, or the most terrifying quiet of all, the sudden stillness of a port under blockade, when the familiar creak of arriving ships was replaced by the watchful gaze of enemy sails on the horizon. These were not mere disruptions, they were existential tests. A city's granaries were its financial and psychological safety net, but they were never bottomless. A typical reserve might hold enough grain for 3 to 6 months of normal consumption, a buffer against a single failed harvest or a season of bad weather. This was planning for a stumble, not a collapse. The real nightmare was a compound crisis, a convergence of disasters that stretched the logistical web to its breaking point. A major volcanic eruption, like that of an unknown event in the 6th century, could spew enough ash into the atmosphere to trigger a volcanic winter, cooling the planet and ruining harvests across hemispheres for years. This was a global shock that no single empire's reserves could withstand, or consider a plague not among the general population, but specifically among the dockworkers and carters of Ostia. If the human engine that moved the food fell ill, the mountains of grain would sit uselessly in ship holds and warehouses, mere miles from empty kitchens. In these moments, the brutal mathematics of survival took over. The first official response was always rationing. Authorities would cut the daily bread dole, sometimes by half or more. Bakers would be ordered to mix cheaper, less nutritious grains like barley or millet into the wheat flour, stretching the supply but diminishing its strength. The city would move from a state of plenty to a state of careful, anxious calculation. But if a siege dragged on, or if the supply lines were severed for a season, the calculations grew darker. The social contract began to fray at the edges. Household pets disappeared from the streets. The horses that once pulled carts through the forums were no longer assets of transport, but parcels of protein. Historical accounts from sieges, from ancient Jerusalem to medieval Paris, speak of a grim descent where communities faced impossible choices. These were moments of profound hardship, where the thin veneer of civilization was strained by the most basic need. What makes these crises especially tragic, historians note, is that famine was so rarely about an absolute absence of food. More often, it was a catastrophic failure of distribution and access. There could be granaries bursting with wheat in the province of Numidia, while mothers in the Subura district of Rome watched their children grow weak. The food existed, but the river of logistics had been dammed by corruption, incompetence, or conflict. A provincial governor might hoard grain to sell at obscene prices. A faction in the capital might seize control of the warehouses for political leverage. The very complexity that made the system work also made it susceptible to sabotage, both intentional and accidental. When the bread did not arrive, the political consequences were swift and violent. The Roman mob did not riot over abstract principles of liberty, they rioted over the price of a loaf. The mandate to feed the populace was the oldest and most fundamental contract of governance. An emperor could be unpopular in many ways, but an emperor who failed to keep the grain flowing was an emperor with days left to rule. These crises laid bare the truth, the grandeur of the aqueduct, the majesty of the law, and the glory of the legions all meant nothing if they could not deliver a daily meal. The logistical web was not just a tool of empire, it was the source of its legitimacy. Every sack of grain was a promise, and every empty market stall was a broken one. This constant tension between abundance and collapse raises a final, unsettling question. If the system was so fragile and the stakes were so high, what happened when the center could no longer hold? When the promises made by stone and scroll could simply no longer be kept, the city's hunger did not stop at the edge of a field. It reached deep into the forests and down into the very soil, consuming the landscape itself to sustain its impossible density. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of stew, and every brick in a city wall carried a hidden environmental cost, a debt paid by the hinterland that would quietly compound over centuries. To feed 1 million, you first had to clear the land. Vast swaths of ancient woodland fell to the axe, not just for farmland but for fuel. Consider the sheer thermal energy required. A single public bakery in Rome, operating day and night, needed a constant flow of firewood. Multiply that by hundreds of bakeries, then add the cooking fires of 1 million households, the kilns firing pottery and bricks, and the furnaces producing lime for mortar and plaster. The demand was insatiable. Forests that had stood for millennia were methodically harvested, transforming ecosystems. This deforestation did more than just provide fuel, it altered the local climate. Trees that once regulated rainfall and held soil in place were gone. The result was often a drier, more extreme environment with hotter summers and more unpredictable water cycles, ironically making the next season's harvest less secure. The impact extended beneath the surface into the earth that grew the food. Ancient farmers practiced intensive agriculture, planting the same staple crops year after year on the same land to meet the relentless urban demand. Without modern fertilizers or scientific crop rotation, this slowly but surely mined the soil of its nutrients. The land grew tired, yields would gradually decline, forcing a difficult choice. One option was to let fields lie fallow to recover, but that meant reducing the total harvest in the short term, a risky move when a city's appetite never paused. The more common solution was to push the agricultural frontier outward, clearing yet more forest to create new farmland, further and further from the city. This created a vicious cycle. As the farms moved farther away, the distance the grain had to travel increased. Transport costs measured in time, donkey feed and barge trips soared. The logistical web stretched thinner, becoming more expensive and more vulnerable to disruption. The eroded soil from these overworked fields did not just vanish. Washed away by rain, it flowed into the rivers and canals that were the empire's lifelines. This siltation was a silent, slow-moving crisis. Canals that were engineered with precise, gentle slopes to guide barges would gradually fill with mud. Riverbeds rose, making them shallower and more difficult to navigate. A waterway that once carried 10 barges a day might, over decades, only carry 5. Maintaining these channels required constant, back-breaking dredging by armies of laborers, an endless fight against the very land the empire depended upon. This ancient interplay reveals a profound truth. The grand logistical systems were not just engineering triumphs, they were a continuous negotiation with nature. Every decision to expand a farm, to build a new bakery, or to fell another stand of trees had ripple effects that echoed through the ecosystem. A city could flourish for centuries by drawing down the natural capital of its surrounding regions, but it was building on a foundation that was slowly being consumed. The system's greatest strength, its ability to concentrate resources from a vast area, was also its greatest ecological vulnerability. It asked everything of the land, and sometimes the land had nothing left to give. This slow erosion of the foundation posed a question that no ledger could answer. How long could the center hold when the edges were fraying? Even the strongest back had its breaking point. When the sheer physical scale of the task threatened to overwhelm the human engine, ancient engineers turned to a simple but profound principle: mechanical advantage. They built machines that allowed one person to do the work of 10, not through magic, but through clever physics, targeting the most exhausting bottlenecks in the entire supply chain. The relentless need to grind grain into flour was one of these critical choke points. For centuries, it was done by hand with saddle querns, or by animals walking in endless circles to turn heavy millstones. It was slow, brutal work. The solution emerged from the sound of rushing water. By channeling an aqueduct's flow down a steep slope on Rome's Janiculum Hill, engineers built a complex of water-powered grain mills. The force of the falling water turned a series of large wooden wheels, each connected to a grinding stone. This was not a single mill, but an industrial bakery's power source, operating day and night without rest. It automated the most muscle-bound step in bread production, freeing countless hands for other tasks and ensuring a more predictable, voluminous supply of flour for the city's ovens. Down at the docks, another machine transformed the pace of unloading. Moving a 1-ton amphora of olive oil from the hold of a rocking ship to a stable dock was a dangerous, back-straining ordeal. The Roman solution was the treadwheel crane. Imagine a giant wooden wheel like a hamster wheel built for humans. Inside, several workers would walk forward, their collective weight and motion turning the wheel. This rotation wound a thick rope around an axle, hoisting the massive cargo smoothly out of the ship and swinging it safely onto the quay. What once required a precarious line of 20 men struggling up a gangplank could now be accomplished by a smaller team working in relative safety and with far greater control. It sped up port operations dramatically, reducing the time ships spent idle and vulnerable in the harbor. The quest for efficiency reached into the processing of other essentials. For olives and grapes, the goal was to extract every precious drop of oil and juice. The simple lever press was improved upon with the invention of the screw press. By turning a large wooden screw, workers could apply immense steady pressure to crushed fruit, increasing the yield and consistency of the product. These were not machines of the Industrial Revolution, but they were fundamental amplifiers of human labor. Their adoption and spread were directly fueled by the logistical demands of megacities. When you need to process mountains of grain, unload 100 ships before a storm, and press 1 million olives before they spoil, you cannot rely on muscle alone. You must build tools that multiply effort. This quiet revolution in gears, water, and leverage proves a timeless truth, that necessity is indeed the mother of invention, especially when that necessity is measured in the daily hunger of 1 million souls. The rhythm of the docks and the precision of the ledgers created a city that could eat, but it did not create a city that ate the same. The daily miracle of the food supply did not flatten society. It etched its hierarchies even deeper, transforming social status into something you could literally taste. From the emperor's palace to the crowded apartment block, what arrived on your plate was the most direct report on your place in the world. The entire logistical machine, for all its egalitarian purpose in preventing famine, was meticulously calibrated to deliver difference. For the senatorial elite, the global supply chain was a personal pantry. Their tables showcased the system's most astonishing capabilities. Out-of-season fruits, like figs in winter, were not miracles of botany but of speed, rushed from distant provinces by fast couriers on relay horses. Exotic spices from India and Arabia, transported across thousands of miles by sea and caravan, flavored dishes that were as much about display as nutrition. Fresh fish packed in wet seaweed and raced from the coast, or tender cuts of meat from specially fattened animals, demonstrated a command over time and distance that money alone could buy. Their banquets were theatrical displays of logistical power, edible proof that the empire's reach could bend nature's seasons for their pleasure. For the common citizen, the system's promise was stability, not variety. Their dietary world was built on the sturdy, state-managed pillars of the Annona: wheat, olive oil, and wine. The grain dole provided the flour for bread, the caloric bedrock of life. The oil was both a nutrient and a fuel for lamps. The wine, often watered down or turned into posca, a tart, vinegar-based drink that was safe to consume, provided crucial calories and a brief respite. This was a healthy, sustaining diet by ancient standards, but it was monotonous. Access to the fresher, more perishable goods, leafy greens, a piece of cheese, a few eggs depended on the small, local market and the spare coins left after rent. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps tasted at a public festival or a family sacrifice. Below them, the non-citizens, the enslaved, and the destitute lived on the logistical margins. They subsisted on what the main channels rejected or missed: the cheapest pulses like lentils or fava beans, the grain that was too coarse or slightly spoiled, the scraps from the butcher's stall. Their nutrition was precarious, a constant calculation at the edge of sufficiency. For them, the city's great bounty was a spectacle witnessed from a distance, its smells a daily reminder of a hierarchy enforced not by gates or guards, but by the marketplace itself. This edible inequality was not an accident, it was policy codified into law. Sumptuary laws, enacted at various times in Rome and other societies, explicitly dictated who could consume what. These rules might limit the number of certain fish or types of fowl one could serve at a banquet based on social rank, or restrict the use of imported spices to the highest classes. The intent was to make social status visible and to prevent the newly wealthy from blurring the lines of the established order. What you were legally allowed to eat became a public declaration of who you were. Thus, every meal was a quiet reinforcement of the social contract. The senator enjoying peppered oysters understood his place at the apex of the system that brought them. The laborer dipping his bread in posca understood the state's obligation to provide his basics. The enslaved person eating a bowl of pulses understood his exclusion from that covenant. The logistics did more than prevent starvation. It served a daily, tangible lesson in order. It translated the abstract idea of class into the immediate experience of the palate, ensuring that the empire's greatest achievement, feeding 1 million, also solidified the very hierarchies that held it together. This intricate dance of survival and status, however, could not exist in a vacuum. It required a shared story, a common belief that justified why some feasted while others merely subsisted. The taste of your meal was shaped by news traveling faster than the ship that brought it. In the silent offices of the Prefectus Annoni, the most valuable commodity was not grain but information. A delayed report from Egypt could mean empty markets in Rome a month later. To manage a continent-spanning system that moved at the speed of sail and ox cart, administrators had to build a nervous system that moved at the speed of a galloping horse. They created an early warning network, a web of couriers, signal towers, and fast scout ships dedicated to one purpose: turning uncertainty into strategy. The famous Roman cursus publicus was not just a postal service for imperial decrees. Its relay stations, spaced a day's ride apart with fresh horses and riders, formed the information backbone of the grain supply. A message about a poor wheat harvest in North Africa or a pirate outbreak near Sicily could race from the coast to Rome in days, not weeks. Similarly, the Persian Royal Road, with its own efficient courier system, was as vital for economic intelligence as for military command. These were the fiber optic cables of the ancient world, carrying data that dictated the movement of millions of tons of food. Merchants operated their own parallel intelligence networks. A trading house with offices in Alexandria, Carthage, and Ostia relied on a constant stream of letters carried on commercial vessels. These dispatches contained the kind of granular detail bureaucrats craved: the going price for olive oil in a provincial market, rumors of unrest in a mining region, or sightings of storm damage to a key harbor. This private market intelligence was often more current and nuanced than official reports. Smart administrators cultivated relationships with these merchant networks, understanding that a ship captain's gossip about wind patterns could be as crucial as a governor's formal harvest estimate. The goal was to see over the horizon. Before a hungry mob could gather in the forum, the logistics master needed to know a problem was coming. A report of drought in the Nile Delta meant he could immediately order extra shipments from Sicily. News of a shipwreck off Greece meant he could reroute the next grain convoy through safer waters. A dispatch about bandits attacking carts on the Appian Way meant he could dispatch military escorts before the next caravan set out. This flow of data allowed for something remarkable: proactive crisis management. Instead of merely reacting to a famine after it began, the system could work to prevent it from ever reaching the capital. Upon receiving word of a regional harvest failure, officials could calculate the shortfall and begin releasing grain from strategic reserves in that area, stabilizing local prices and preventing a flood of desperate refugees from overwhelming the city. They could adjust the sailing schedules of the grain fleet, directing ships to ports where the need was greatest. This transformed the granary network from a static stockpile into a dynamic tool. Its contents shifted around the empire like pieces on a chessboard, guided by information from the edges of the board. In an age without telegraphs or satellites, this relentless pursuit of timely knowledge was a form of logistical magic. It turned the chaotic fog of distance and delay into a map upon which one could plan. The clerk scratching a number onto a wax tablet in a port office was not just keeping a record, he was feeding a system that sought to see the future, or at least to outrun the slow, terrible speed of bad news. The principles etched in Roman ledgers did not fade with the marble. They were a blueprint passed down through centuries, adapted and reforged to feed new cities rising from different soil. Medieval Paris, for instance, pulsed to a familiar rhythm, its lifeblood flowing up the River Seine on flat-bottomed barges piled high with grain from the fertile plains of the Isle de France. This was not a free market in the modern sense. The entire trade was controlled by the powerful Guild of Water Merchants, a corporate body granted a royal monopoly. They set the rules, managed the ports along the river, and ensured that the city's daily bread arrived with a predictability that kept both the palace and the populace calm. It was a direct descendant of the Roman model, where a privileged, regulated body managed the critical flow of sustenance, blending commerce with a deep sense of public duty. The fear of hunger remained the prime motivator of urban policy. In England, this ancient anxiety was codified into law with the assize of bread. First established in the 13th century and lasting for over 600 years, this law directly continued the tradition of the Roman cura annoni and the Islamic mutazib. It did not set a fixed price for a loaf. Instead, it set a fixed price for the baker's profit, linking the cost of bread directly to the fluctuating market price of wheat. Magistrates would publicly announce the current price of grain, and from that, using a complex official formula, they would calculate the lawful weight for a penny loaf. A baker caught selling a loaf that was underweight for the price faced severe fines, public humiliation in the pillory, or worse. This was market regulation as a moral and practical imperative, a transparent contract between the city and its bakers to prevent profiteering from desperation. As cities grew even larger in the early modern period, their appetites and their supply chains expanded across maps. London's explosive growth after the 16th century was not just a story of people, but of fuel and grain. The city's insatiable demand for heat and industrial energy was met by the coal fleets from Newcastle, a sooty armada that made the Thames run black. But just as vital were the grain ships arriving from the Baltic Sea, from Poland and Prussia, turning the North Sea into a new Mediterranean for England. London could no longer feed itself from its own countryside. It now depended on wind-powered ships crossing open ocean and on the political stability of distant kingdoms. This was the old Roman reality reborn, a capital sustained by global reach. The bureaucratic machinery to manage this dependency grew more sophisticated, but its core functions were recognizable: to assure supply, regulate quality, and maintain public order. Tax records, port dues, and guild regulations from Paris or London would not have seemed entirely foreign to a clerk from Ostia or Chang'an. The fundamental equation remained unchanged. A dense population of non-farmers required a vast, reliable, and politically managed extraction of resources from a wide hinterland. The challenge of urban feeding was the relentless engine behind state building, commercial law, and technological innovation for 2,000 years. It pushed societies to build canals, standardize measurements, and invent new financial instruments for trade. It forced governments to develop administrative capacities just to count and move what was needed. Right up until the moment steam engines began to turn and canning jars were sealed, the survival of the great city still hung on the harvest, the wind, and the strength of a bargeman's back. This long continuity raises a final, powerful question. What did it all truly cost, not in coin, but in the shape of the world it left behind? This centralized hunger was not the only way to organize a civilization. For every Rome or Chang'an, there existed an empire that thrived by moving its center of gravity, choosing a web of connections over a single, voracious heart. The sprawling domains of the Mongols or the early Islamic caliphates achieved breathtaking scale without the anchor of a permanent megacity. Their logistical genius was not about concentration, but about enabling flow across impossible distances. Instead of building aqueducts to one point, they built caravanserais fortified in spaced a day's journey apart. Along the Silk Road, these were not granaries, but way stations offering shelter, water, and security to the countless caravans that formed a decentralized, living supply chain. Goods, ideas, and people moved in a constant, distributed stream, nourishing hundreds of cities and towns rather than feeding one colossal urban giant. The Mongol Yam system perfected this logic of motion. It was a continent-spanning network of relay stations with fresh horses and riders, allowing messages and envoys to travel from the Danube to the Pacific in weeks. This system moved information and authority with stunning speed, but it was not designed to haul millions of tons of wheat to a single market. It moved light, valuable goods, silks, spices, silver, and the commands that held a steppe empire together. The contrast is illuminating. The million-person city was a black hole pulling all resources inward. The steppe empire was a vast nervous system with pulses of energy moving across its entire surface. One required absolute control over a static hinterland, turning diverse farms into monocultures of wheat or rice for the capital. The other relied on the resilience of trade routes and the mobility of its people, drawing strength from the variety of many different regions without demanding everything from any one of them. This reveals a profound truth about the ancient world's logistical choices. Building a Chang'an was a specific, extreme gamble. It demanded a perfect alignment of geographic luck, a great river or a sheltered sea, and political power capable of commanding the entire agricultural output of regions for generations. It created breathtaking monuments and cultural flourishing, but it also created a terrifying point of failure. When the Grand Canal silted up or the Egyptian harvest failed, the entire system shuddered. The decentralized model was more resilient to a local shock but required a different kind of strength: constant negotiation with distant powers, protection of far-flung routes, and a political identity not rooted in a single urban monument. One model concentrated risk for the sake of unparalleled cultural density. The other distributed risk across a network, accepting a thinner spread of people and power. The story of feeding humanity, therefore, is not one of progress toward a single model, but a series of brilliant, context-specific answers to the same relentless question: how do we live together? The silent symphony of Rome and the thrumming network of the Silk Road were both masterpieces of their kind, each leaving a different imprint on the land and a different legacy for the future. The true power of the granary was not just in its wooden beams, but in its shadow. A city could survive on stored grain for months, but it could not survive a single day on panic. The most dangerous shortage was not of wheat, but of trust. A whispered rumor in the market that the Egyptian fleet was lost could empty shelves faster than any storm, as families scrambled to hoard whatever they could find, creating the very scarcity they feared. This meant the logistical system had a psychological twin, a parallel operation dedicated not to moving food, but to managing minds. Public confidence was not a byproduct of the system, it was the system's essential fuel. To understand this, you must see the city not just as a machine of consumption, but as a nervous organism, perpetually listening for the heartbeat of its own supply. The regular, visible arrival of the grain fleet was not a mundane commercial event, it was a civic ritual. In Rome, the sight of the tall sails rounding the coast into Ostia was a public spectacle, a living advertisement of imperial competence. The procession of barges being towed up the Tiber was a moving festival of abundance, watched by crowds on the banks. Each ship was a promise kept, a physical rebuttal to the nagging fear that the world beyond the horizon had failed. The granaries themselves were architectural propaganda. Their sheer, imposing walls, often located prominently near the city center or the forum, were not meant to be hidden. They were monuments to stability. A citizen walking past the massive doors of the horrea galbi received a silent, powerful message. Behind that stone lay the difference between order and chaos. The state understood that these buildings had to be seen to be believed, their very presence a psychological bulwark against uncertainty. This theater of abundance reached its peak in the act of distribution. When an emperor or a local magistrate personally handed out loaves of bread or presided over a public feast, it was a masterclass in political theater. It transformed a transactional welfare program into a moment of personal connection and paternal care. The Roman grain dole token, the tessera, was more than a ration card. It was a tangible token of membership in a system that promised to remember you. This careful stagecraft had a very practical goal: to prevent the volatile chemistry of rumor from igniting into the fire of riot. History shows that urban populations often revolted not during the depths of a famine, but at the first sharp spike in the price of bread or upon news of a delayed shipment. The fear of hunger was often more politically potent than hunger itself. This constant, low-grade anxiety shaped the urban psyche, making every citizen an amateur economist and a political barometer. The price of a loaf was the most sensitive gauge of governmental competence. A stable price meant the gods were pleased and the emperor was in control. A rising price was a red flag, a signal that the invisible threads holding the world together were fraying. This made the populace deeply reactive, their loyalty as fluid as the market. A leader who could guarantee cheap bread could weather many scandals. A leader who could not, no matter his other achievements, was living on borrowed time. Therefore, the bureaucracy's ledgers tracked more than bushels, they tracked morale. Officials monitored market gossip as closely as ship manifests. The decision to release grain from the reserves was often timed not just to physical need, but to public sentiment, to get ahead of a story before it could twist into a dangerous myth. In the end, the millions of tons of wheat, the thousands of miles of canals, and the armies of clerks were all in service of a fragile idea: trust. The system asked 1 million people to live their lives in a dense web of interdependence, to wake up each day believing that the complex, invisible machinery would deliver once more. That belief was the final, invisible pillar holding the entire civilization aloft. It was the quiet agreement that let the city sleep at night, even as its great hunger reached out across continents in the dark. The true scale of this system is not locked in scrolls alone, but buried in the earth itself. Walk through the ruins of Ostia, Rome's ancient port, and you can still see the distinctive pillars that once held up the floors of the massive horrea. These raised foundations were not an architectural whim. They were a deliberate defense against dampness and rats, a physical solution to the timeless problem of rot. Step into the hollow shell of a public bakery nearby, and your fingers can trace the soot-blackened stones of an oven that ran for centuries, its heat a direct echo of the city's daily hunger. These stones do not speak, but they testify with absolute clarity to the relentless, industrialized routine required to keep 1 million people fed. Beneath the waves, a different kind of archive lies preserved. Shipwrecks like the Madrague de Jeans off the coast of France reveal the staggering cargo capacity of Roman grain carriers. The whole structure shows a design optimized for volume over speed, a floating warehouse built to haul hundreds of tons of wheat. Nearby amphorae, the ceramic containers for oil, wine, and fish sauce remained stacked in rows as they were on the day the ship sank, a frozen moment in a supply chain 2,000 years old. Each amphora bears a stamp, a maker's mark, or a merchant's seal, which archaeologists can trace back to specific regions, mapping the flow of goods across the Mediterranean as accurately as any ancient ledger. On land, the science of osteoarchaeology reads the story of this supply chain in the most intimate place possible, the human body. By analyzing the chemical isotopes in bones and teeth from ancient burial sites, researchers can determine what people ate over their lifetimes. A skeleton found in Rome might show a dietary signature of North African grain, while one from a frontier town in Britain reveals a more local, less varied diet. We can see the nutritional divide between social classes etched into bone, evidence of who had access to the empire's bounty and who lived on its margins. Even the remains of animals in city garbage pits tell a tale, showing the shift from frequent, small-scale butchering to the industrial-scale processing that supplied the masses. The silent evidence extends to the residues trapped inside the most common artifact of all, pottery. Chemical analysis of a seemingly empty clay jar can detect microscopic traces of olive oil, wine, or fermented fish sauce. This allows historians to trace the trade routes of these essential commodities, proving that a cooking pot found in a London home might have once held olive oil pressed in southern Spain. It turns broken pottery, the clutter of every archaeological dig, into a data point on a vast economic map. Perhaps the most humbling evidence is the landscape itself, reshaped by logistical need. The course of the Grand Canal in China is not a natural river, but a deliberate scar across the continent, a monument to political will that is visible from space. The eroded hillsides around the Mediterranean, stripped of trees for fuel and shipbuilding, speak to the environmental cost of maintaining such concentrated consumption. Each piece of evidence, from a ship's timber to a fish bone, is a fragment of a single, interconnected reality. They confirm that the descriptions left by scribes were not boasts or myths, but understated reports of a daily miracle. This was not magic, it was engineering, economics, and human labor operating on a continental scale, and its footprints are everywhere, waiting for us to learn how to read them. That stone and parchment world of granaries and sailing seasons held for millennia, until a single invention quietly broke its oldest rules. Mechanical refrigeration did not arrive as a mere improvement, like a better millstone or a faster ship. It was a revolution in the physics of decay itself, shattering the ancient paradigm that had dictated human settlement since the first cities rose. The invisible wall of the food shed, that limited radius defined by how far food could travel before spoiling, simply dissolved. Suddenly, a strawberry grown in Chile could appear on a table in Chicago in the dead of winter. The Argentine plains could supply beef to London not as salted jerky, but as fresh, chilled cuts. Seasonality, that relentless drumbeat of the agricultural calendar that dictated the diet of emperors and peasants alike, faded into a historical curiosity for those who could afford the new global bounty. The central logistical challenge pivoted from a desperate race against time to a complex, energy-intensive ballet of constant cold. This was the birth of the cold chain, a seamless, temperature-controlled journey from farm to fork that required not just ships and carts, but refrigerated rail cars, insulated trucks, and humming warehouse freezers, all linked together. The ancient granary, once the mightiest building in the city, was now joined by the sprawling, anonymous distribution center on the urban outskirts, a temple to a new kind of preservation. This shift fundamentally altered the geography of power. A city's food security was no longer chained to the fertility of its immediate hinterland or the loyalty of a few key provinces. It could draw from dozens of countries, spreading risk across the entire globe. A drought in one hemisphere could be offset by a surplus in another, theoretically making the kind of famine that stalked ancient capitals a relic of the past. This global buffet enabled the rise of the modern megacity of 10, 20, even 30 million people, a scale that would have been pure fantasy to a Roman prefect. Yet this new freedom came with its own profound dependencies and vulnerabilities. The modern city traded the threat of local crop failure for a deep entanglement in a web of international politics, fossil fuel prices, and the fragile reliability of that endless, invisible chain of cold. If the electricity fails, the chain breaks, and the mountain of perishables begins its swift, silent return to the laws of the ancient world. The challenge of feeding humanity entered a new chapter, no longer about conquering distance with sweat, but about maintaining a perpetual, powered winter across the entire planet. These 5 pillars formed a single, living architecture, each stone leaning on the next. Picture them not as a list, but as a great vaulted ceiling, holding up the sky above 1 million people. The first stone was the land itself, reshaped into a productive hinterland. This was not the passive countryside, but an active, engineered factory for calories, where forests and marshes gave way to geometric fields, all tuned to the distant city's relentless pulse. The second stone was the preservation network, the granaries and the alchemy of salt, smoke, and fermentation. This was the art of stopping time, of creating edible futures that could wait patiently in the dark for the moment of need. The third stone was the transport web, the roads, rivers, and sea lanes that became the empire's circulatory system. This was the conquest of distance, turning continents into neighbors through the groan of cart axles and the billow of sailcloth. The fourth stone was the administrative framework, the quiet hum of the bureaucracy. This was the system's memory and its foresight, a nervous system of scribes, ledgers, and regulations that sought to predict scarcity before it ever reached a hungry mouth. And the fifth, final stone was the social-political contract, the story that held it all together. This was the ideology, the religion, and the raw political power that transformed backbreaking labor and complex logistics into a divine or imperial duty, a sacred promise of bread and stability. Remove any one of these and the entire structure groans. A rich hinterland is useless without granaries to store its surplus. Full granaries are meaningless without a transport web to connect them to the city. A perfect transport system collapses into chaos without administrators to schedule and regulate its flow. And even a perfectly administered system will be torn apart by its own people if it lacks a compelling story, a reason for all that effort that goes beyond mere survival. This framework was not a blueprint found in a library. It was the hard-won result of centuries of trial and heartbreaking error. It was written in the lessons of 100 failed harvests, in the ruins of ports choked by silt, and in the quiet adjustments made by a foreman on a dock who found a better way to load a barge. It was a masterpiece of collaborative human effort, a symphony composed by countless unnamed conductors, the farmer, the sailor, the scribe, the baker, each playing their part in a rhythm so constant it became the background noise of civilization, utterly invisible to the very people whose lives it sustained every single day. This invisible cathedral of logistics raises a final, humbling thought for our own time. We have replaced the granary with the refrigerator, the ox cart with the cargo jet, and the papyrus scroll with the digital cloud. But have we truly moved beyond those 5 pillars, or have we simply built them anew on a planetary scale, with dependencies and fragilities we are only beginning to understand? The silent symphony had a single, profound purpose: to make the incredible seem ordinary. For the citizens of Rome or Chang'an, waking to the smell of fresh bread from the neighborhood bakery was not a miracle, it was simply Tuesday. That was the ultimate success of the entire system, to render its own staggering complexity invisible, to turn a continent-spanning ballet of human effort into the unremarkable rhythm of daily life. The logistics behind feeding cities of 1 million before refrigeration stand as one of humanity's greatest yet most underrated achievements. We remember the gladiators and the emperors, the poets and the philosophers, but we often forget the farmers, the sailors, the scribes, and the engineers whose collective toil made those legends possible. They performed a complex, endless dance with nature, geography, and society itself, bending each to serve a single, fragile idea: urban civilization. This was not just about moving food, it was about moving mountains of trust. Every sack of grain that arrived on time was a promise kept, a brick in the wall of social order. Every stable bread price was a victory over chaos. These systems built the world's first globalized economies, threading together the wheat fields of Africa, the rice paddies of the Yangtze, and the olive groves of Spain into interdependent networks that foreshadowed our own. In doing so, they laid the indispensable administrative groundwork for the modern state, inventing the tools of census, taxation, standardized measurement, and public welfare out of sheer necessity. We live in the world they engineered. Today, we face a new generation of logistical challenges, questions of environmental sustainability, and supply chain resilience on a planetary scale. Our solutions will be built with silicon and satellite, but looking back at these ancient answers offers us more than just wonder. It offers a deep well of wisdom. It reminds us that civilization is not merely a collection of great art or grand conquests. At its core, civilization is the practical, relentless, and beautiful organization of abundance. It is the daily choice to build systems that allow millions to thrive together, to turn the raw stuff of the earth into shared security and possibility. That ancient project continues with every ship in a sea lane, every truck on a highway, and every entry in a database. It is the ongoing story of how we choose to feed each other. If you found this deep dive into the hidden engines of ancient cities fascinating, we would love to hear your thoughts. What aspect of this historical logistics amazed you the most? Share your reflections in the comments below. And for more journeys into the forgotten frameworks that built our world, be sure to subscribe.